This podcast is brought to you by the GTFurther Team in conjunction with Constellations.
We go further when we honor our universe.
This is your host, Kelly Mead, 2017 GTF.
And I'm Alicia Lindsay, 2019 GTF. And we are excited to welcome you to the podcast.
Yes, FFX Summer Sizzle. That's the Friday Further X.
This month, we are exploring the topic of finding your North Star. We hope our guest today, Mike Johnston, will help you understand how to find and act on your life's purpose.
I am Mike Johnston, and definitely a stargazer. I have the potential to let people know that if you open yourselves up to the poetry that other people are living, you really open yourself up to sort of weaving in new stories to the one that you live yourself.
Mike is a 2017 GTF to the Galapagos and author of the recently published book, You Are Poetry: How to See and Grow the Poet in Your Students and Yourself.
Every time we have something to say, or we're asking people to see us the way we see ourselves, that's poetry. Like it's emotional literacy at its best, where you're saying, I see the world in a certain way. I see the world through my eyes, and the minute you are curious and caring enough to sort of take on the way another person sees the world, that's what poetry is.
Tell us more about Optimus Prime and his transformative influence in writing the book.
That to me started out as sort of like kind of an homage to the things that I had always fallen in love with. I have always been a big fan of the things that I fell in love with as a kid, Transformers and cartoons and everything like this. I have Transformers in more rooms of the house and in my classroom than I care to admit. I love the idea. But then when I sat down to write the book, I had this huge challenge of wanting to thank too many people. They said you have to write a little thank you note, and I thought to myself, the second you thank one person, there's 1.5 million people that you really wished you could have. And the beauty of this is that the people that I met before and during and after the process of creating the book, so many people have connected with me through this process, and I just didn't want to leave anyone out. So I said, how can I be clever and sort of put something that's meaningful without leaving anyone out? And I said, I looked up and I saw Optimus Prime, because I'm always pretty close to a Transformer.
Right.
And I saw him and I said, you know what? That's kind of the ticket, because that's the beauty of it, is Transformers hide as one thing until they transform into another. Like they hide in plain sight as cars. All these things that we drive by, these Autobots that could just be sitting there doing absolutely nothing, and then they transform into these big, powerful, you have to notice me things, right? And I thought that's a really apt metaphor for what I'm trying to do here. I'm trying to make sure that people realize that all these cars we're driving by all the time have people in them, and all those people have stories in them. So there's something really transformative about the idea of the people you walk by all the time are actually just like beautiful poems just hiding in plain sight. And I was pretty lucky that got all wrapped around in the idea of Optimus Prime for me. So it ended up working out pretty okay.
Well, Mike, we're so thankful that you are able to join us and talk to us. Again, our topic is all about finding your North Star, your purpose. And our first question is, about that. Can you share with us your journey to understand your purpose?
Absolutely, and thanks for the invite. I love the idea of the North Star. Stars have always played a pretty big role for me in the metaphor of all of this. So I really appreciate that as a perspective. I feel like the journey to understanding my purpose was like stargazing a little bit. It just gets dark and then all the stars are coming out and you get to know each one of them individually and understand and appreciate them and know them. But then understanding my purpose felt like a gut punch when all of a sudden the stars stopped being stars and started to be constellations. Like they just made sense together. It's I've said this before, but it was really like understanding a story that you never knew you always knew. As a teacher, I had always seen the importance in every student's story and of helping everyone I interacted with, a student or otherwise, to embrace the value of their own voice and see how important the poem that they're living is to themselves and to everyone else. And that was a general thing for me. I hadn't identified yet that was really like my purpose. I just knew that it was something that was important. And then I was named National Geographic Grosvenor Fellow in 2017, way back in 2017. And I had the chance to teach a poetry workshop on a Lindblad vessel in the Galapagos Islands, like right on the equator. We're sitting teaching a poetry session. It's just me and a whole bunch of, beautiful, wonderful people, some of whom were naturalists and some of whom were people on the boat. Like people from all parts of the boat came together. And so many of us had a similarity. We talked a lot about the senses and how do we get people who have never been to the Galapagos to understand. And so many people talked about the taste and feel of salt. They talked about the taste and feel of salt on their lips and on their skin, and how they would never forget that. This little ocean spray just hit them in the face. And then I had a little hand go up. One of the younger members of our crew, a kid, a school-age kid who was there with her family, put her hand up and she said, "Yeah, I had salt too, but the reason I talked about salt is because that salt taste sort of scared me. It reminded me of the salty taste of like processed foods and all the oversalted things that we can buy and commodify. And I looked around and I understood that like that taste of salt reminded me of fries back home. And all of a sudden I looked around and everything looked like things that could be bought and sold and commodified. And everyone in the room was a little bottomed out by it, and in all the best ways. They're like, oh my goodness, like something that we all associated really positively, you had a whole different experience. And for me, I think that was one of the moments that really solidified that North Star feeling. Like I just felt like it was really important to sort of highlight and empower the voices of the people around me, and to make sure that people could hear and value and interact with the poems that everybody else is living, I should say, because otherwise you miss things like that. And I wouldn't have known that had I not listened to the pieces that were coming out of another person. I just would have had, the majesty and the taste of the salt. It was really eye-opening, and I think that helped me sort of find the North Star of my purpose. Like that connective tissue, that value in the voice of others. It's really immense, because as human beings, we're wonderfully limited. Like we can only live the one life that we have, and that's great because it makes sure that we appreciate what we have. But it doesn't give us enough time. It doesn't give us enough time to see and do and experience everything. So in all the most selfish, but all the most selfless ways, the more we sort of value each other, the more we value ourselves.
A recent Berkeley article suggested that purpose is tied to having better health, longevity, and even economic success. It feels good to have a sense of purpose, knowing that you are using your skills to help others in a way that matters to you.
So, Mike, poetry is obviously an integral component of your life. How can it aid others in their journey to find their North Star?
I feel like poetry is like small scale, impassioned, imaginative communication. Like poetry to me is emotional literacy. It's an openness and a capacity to listen and understand and empathize and connect to the feelings of other people. In terms of using poetry to find that North Star, I think there's huge value in giving space to others and asking them for that connection and looking for that connection, but then giving yourself that space and time to ask, how would I connect who I am and what matters about me to the world outside of myself? And I think that's going to allow people to discover their North Star, or even just strengthen the glow of the North Star that they've already found, because it gives people permission to own and embrace their purpose, and they see it and they understand it because they are the one and only human person that is ever going to have that connection to that North Star in that way. You are the only you that will ever you, right? So if you find this North Star and you have this thing that you are passionate about, then the poetry of that is you finding ways to make people understand why this lights you on fire. Why, what about you makes you uniquely qualified to fall in love with your North Star and to follow it and to just make it part of who you are?
What practical steps? I know there are some great skills listed in your book, and I just want to pump your book up. You Are Poetry, How to See and Grow the Poet in Your Students and Yourself. But what are the practical steps that our listeners can take towards finding their North Star? What can they do to work on finding that focal point?
I guess my number one practical step that you can take is ask and listen, especially now in a time where there is so much wonderful vocalization of people who have been marginalized, especially people who have had hundreds of years of having to listen to other perspectives. Now is a time where there are so many beautiful, wonderful voices that are finally feeling empowered enough to make their own case in the world. So now is the best time in history so far to just listen. And I want to make it clear that I really mean like working on the listening skill set as well, because there is listening and there's waiting for your chance to contribute. Like if you want to be an honest listener, that's just listening. And that's thinking about why this person is saying this. Like poetry is about very careful language. Poetry is about trying to find a very specific way to say something huge in a very limited space. So if you have 5 minutes to talk to another person and you're going to listen to them for 5 minutes, listen to them for 5 minutes. And if you're going to ask questions, make sure they have something to do with the why of what they're saying, right? So become a great listener. Ask for the poetry of other people. Like just let people know that they are valuable around you, because I cannot stress enough the fact that my North Star really made itself clear to me when I started to listen more to other people. When I stopped trying to make sure that I had the most effective pathways to make sure my own voice was heard and really started to create space for other people and listen, that grew who I was infinitely. So once you listen enough and hear that passion in other people and hear and see what other people are about, give yourself the time and space to do the same for yourself. And then the last piece of practical advice is be unapologetic. Like whatever it is in your life that you feel is a North Star, that you feel is something that gets you fired up, you do not have to apologize for that. You don't have to be unabashedly in love with your North Star. As long as it's not hurting anybody else, as long as it's not affecting anybody else's North Star, then your North Star is beautiful and wonderful and awesome. Especially, some people think that the things that they're doing have less value because there's less people who care about them on a grand scheme. I've had students come in and apologize for the things that they're into. Like, I know this is really, not cool, but, and I stop them right there and I say, no. Like, whatever gets you out of bed, whatever gets you fired up, if you're fired up, I'm fired up. Because I like you. I don't need to like the same things that you like. I like you. And I like that you are experiencing them. And I like that you know that I care enough about you to listen.
You make a great point, yet I think people forget to distinguish between listening and hearing. They are definitely two different things. When we listen, the listener has a purpose, whereas hearing is the siren going down the street, which can't be avoided. Listening requires you to become informative about a person's situation, or empathetic, maybe, I guess the word would be. Hearing is not truly listening. So We
Absolutely.
may hear our students in the classroom, and maybe we miss things, though, because we're not truly listening to their story and what they're trying to say, or our colleagues even. We may hear them, but are we truly listening and empathizing and gaining perspective to be able to make our lives more informative?
And I get it. Like, teachers, this is the busiest time for educators ever. Like, I have been teaching for like 15 years now. I have never been asked to do more as a teacher than this year, and that's fine. Like, work is work. That's why they call it that. Like, it is supposed to be hard if it's going to be valuable. I really go back to the idea there that the more we value each other, the more we value ourselves. When I really stop and listen, those are nice, quiet, calming moments too. Like when it's just me listening to another person's, the poetry that they're living in their life, and I really honestly connect to that. There is nothing else. There's no emails to return. There's no stuff to grade. There's no paperwork. There's no nothing. There's just me and another human person, and the ability to connect. There are 7.5, almost 8 billion points of history right now, and we could choose to connect to any and all of them at a very, very quick pace because of the way the world is connected right now. So choosing to be connected to one another is wonderfully important, because that helps us find our North Star by hearing and seeing the passion and value in the things that other people value, and then giving ourselves that same space and permission. It's more selfish than people would think to be a really good listener.
If you could tell us 3 things you're curious about, 2 things you have observed recently, and 1 story you are telling now.
I'm curious about infinite things. I think that's part of what I like about myself, is this infinite curiosity. But the things that I am the most curious about right now, I'm always really curious about how other people define and see poetry in their own lives, mostly because I feel like I see poetry and define poetry a little bit differently. And I love how the edges of the definition of what poetry is are a little bit flexible as well. So I'm always curious as to the relationship that people have with poetry and the definition that people carry of poetry, because part of my North Star mission here is to sort of change the way that people see the word poetry. Like I really do want to change the interpretation of that word. I'm curious about everyone's dream adventure. I think that's my number one question I have for people, because I think that that's a really beautiful way to sort of point out a lot of the things that I really value. Like if you ask someone what their dream vacation is, what their dream adventure, where they want to go, some people are going to say a busy city, and some people are going to say I want to get lost in the forest somewhere. Some people are going to say I need a 5-star, and some people are going to say I need a tent. And regardless of what motivates them, everyone imagines themselves in that dream adventure because something in their imagination ties them to it. Some taste or smell or sound or experience, something they got to see or touch or be part of. And it's so different for everyone that I really am very curious about everyone's dream adventure. If I could sit down with everyone on the planet, I would honestly just listen to tell me your dream adventure. I think it's the best question to start with. Thirdly, I'm also very curious about my ancestors and how they would feel about what my life looks like now, because life was not easy for any of our ancestors, considering what life looks like today. Life was hard for the people who came before us and made the land what it was and made the houses what they were and made the cities what they were. And I've been learning a lot recently about my own Métis heritage, and it makes me very, very curious about what my ancestors from 100 or 200 or 400 or 500 years ago look at my life and go, that's what I was hoping we would earn. Or would they look at me and go, you don't even know how to build a sod house? I'm very curious about how they would reflect on what their bloodline has become and how they would feel about that. 2 things I have observed. I've recently observed the power of nostalgia in a big way with the new Space Jam movie coming out. I found myself driving through just for toys. I'm pulling out old stuff to show, my kids here and everything like that, because there's a whole new movie coming out, and that's a little goofy in what it is, but it's wonderful too, because I have all these great memories from when I was a kid. Like, basketball is one of the passions in my life, and that I don't think I would be as excited about it if I didn't get to watch Michael Jordan, and Bugs Bunny do their thing all those years ago. And now I'm like, yes, it's back, and so nostalgia is hugely powerful, and I've just recently observed that. I've also observed polar bears and monarchs and dinosaurs. In taking the kids to the zoo, we got to see animatronic dinosaurs. And we have this incredible polar bear exhibit in Winnipeg here that's based on Churchill, which I've been to. It's the polar bear capital of the world, they say. It's amazing, just beautiful spot. Our zoo puts a lot of effort into making the habitat really natural. Like, I went there, and then I went to the zoo, and I was like, oh yeah, it's exactly the same experience. And butterflies flying around my house here, because we work really hard to make it like a certified butterfly sanctuary around here. There's a little sign in our yard and everything. So that made me think a lot about the idea of all of the research and supports and consideration and the storytelling of things like, the dinosaurs and everything. All these little pieces that go into making next generation sort of fall in love with animals and with the living things on the planet that we share our space with. And I just think that's super important. We got some big time animal lovers in the house. One story I'm telling is the story of my book, but not the way I thought it would be. I have found a lot of joy in really opening up the process of the book to people, like my students and, my kids here at home. Every step of the little processes of like every edit, every email, every time frame. They're surprised when we talk about how things like the book took about 1.5 years to put together fully, and it, huge editing windows, and started off as X number of words and became X number of words. I showed my students and my own kids the fact that there was 6 original drafts of the cover, and we sat around there like, oh, I hate that aspect of the first draft, but I love this one and I like this color. And been a great piece of storytelling, because it has changed the view and the relationship we have with books in a way. Like, my kids and my students, through that story that I got to tell, I'm super, super lucky to tell it. I know that, but it's also changed the relationships that we've had with books, because each of the books we see now, we realize that somebody put a whole lot of work into it, and they had discussions with their editors, and parts of the book they fought for, and parts of the book they added, and parts of the book, they designed differently, and covers that they might have had 6 options that people scrapped, so that's been a really interesting story to tell, is the journey of this book and what bookmaking actually looks like. There have been a lot of times in my life where really big moments have tied themselves to this idea of constellations, where if you look up, it could be stars. Yeah. But if you look up and weave, like, there are stories up there, if you just look at it differently.
I want to say I was in South Africa, and when you look at the stars in the south, they're totally different than the stars in the north.
Yeah.
And it blew my mind. Yeah. But that was an interesting story, and I don't really tell that often, because I don't know, it was similar inside of our pre-expedition workshop recently. I kind of forgot my story for a second, and I'm like, gosh, I need to tell my story more often, or different stories more often. And I do write, I journal, but to forget like an important, valuable, experience was kind of, and I wanted to say it, but I told a story still. It was a good story, good travel story. But I started thinking about the things that I've written in my journaling while traveling. And when reading your book, I was like, oh, that's kind of like poetry, because I'll write things down that I'm seeing or experiencing and put the feeling that I'm feeling while I'm experiencing it. But I started reading your text in your book, and I said, wow, that is poetry. I would go back and read some of my blog, and I'm like, oh, look at that. And sometimes I would rhyme, sometimes I wouldn't, of course. Most of the time not.
And this is what I'm talking about. Like, sometimes people are so averse to saying, like, I write poetry, because they feel like it has to be forced rhyme or like put into a special system. But like, when you're talking about seeing the stars in South Africa and how it felt totally different to you, that to me connected to the moment where I went to the Galapagos. And as much as stargazing has always been such an important part to me here on the prairies in Canada, when I went to the Galapagos, the first night there was no light pollution and not a cloud in the sky, and I looked up and I just couldn't stop, because it hit me that I was like, man, I'm so thankful that the stars are as infinite as I would have wanted them to be. And I had never seen that before, and I've never seen it since. But it's beautiful because now every time I go at stargazing, I look up and I'm like, I know you're there.
And you remember. You remember.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like that. I know you're there.
We're not always talking, right. But I know you're around.
I know you're around there. Like, I know you're around somewhere. And of course, it's fun because our Earth is a sphere, so I know you're around there somewhere.
Absolutely.
You still exist. You still exist. Yeah. Even if I'm not looking at you, you're still there. But I think that's valuable in sharing and listening, like you said. I may not see you, but I know you're still there because I listened to your story. And I can make a better informed choice or interaction with the next person I listen to, or, the next student I help, the next teacher I work next to, or whatever it might be. But I listened, and I know you're still there, even though I cannot see you.
Yes, we have to find ways to define ourselves as poets. We have to be okay with saying, what I'm doing is poetry. What I'm living is poetry. But people have to understand that poetry, like any other art, is never a one-way street. The most beautiful things are meaningless unless there are people to interact with them. There are moments where you should sit and listen to others and look them in the eye and say, like, you are an infinitely valuable piece of poetry because you are the only person that will ever live the life that you are living. But then there are also moments where you can sit and you can do the same for yourself. There are always moments where we all feel, a little too regular, a little too normal, a little too, one person out of several billion. But that's the uniqueness too. Like, as much as we have to spend time listening to the voices of other people, we have to value our own as well.
Well, that's all for this episode of FFX Summer Sizzle. For more on today's episode and the latest further updates, you can always visit https://educatorexplorersfurther.blogspot.com or visit us on Facebook on the Nat Geo Ed GT Fellows Further page. A special thanks to Mike Johnston for joining us for this episode.
Educators, we want to hear from you. What is your North Star? Add your ideas to the GTFurther hashtags on Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook. Hashtags are #ConnectingFurther and #EducatorExplorer.
Next month's guest is Wendy Pillars, author of 2 books, most recently Visual Impact. Transform communication in your boardroom, classroom, or living room. We do hope you'll tune in. I know podcast hosts ask this all the time, but for real, please take the time to rate, review, and share this podcast. It really does help other people find the show. And, of course, we like reading the reviews. Summer Sizzle drops each month, so be sure to tune back in next month. FFX Summer Sizzle is a GTFurther Team original production. It's hosted by Alicia Lindsay and Kelly V. Mead. From South Dakota, California, and Colorado, The show is produced by Ann C. Lewis, Kelly V. Mead, and Alicia Lindsay. Editing, sound, design, and original scoring by Kelly V. Mead.